Good morning, everyone, both here and wherever you are listening. I appreciate your joining on Sunday mornings and throughout the week as it's available on the podcast. Today, Les and I got into a conversation that started about the idea of not doing everything we can do and thinking about it in terms that may not be as accurate as acknowledging that we're always doing everything we can do in any given moment, but whether or not there is more we can do in time is another question. And that conflict that begins when we start thinking about the present as impossible in some way is a setup to begin to create a conflict that undermines the potential for us to function off of that basis. So the foundation of that thinking creates a very wobbly, interconflicted sense of awareness within thinking anyhow, that can undermine any further steps, progress, that are meaningful and helpful and all that, and sort of repeat the same thing. So this conversation is largely looking at the ways we think, which is something humans do. It's not who we are until we make believe that what we think are truths, that our conclusions are true and real. Do we start thinking who we are is what we think? And to live a life based on an idea that's false would be to live a lie, or at least experience the thinking that has us think we're a liar while we're attempting to prove by doing all sorts of other gymnastics and acrobatics that we're absolutely in control of this perpetuation of ideas we have about ourselves that have no basis, which can be very wearing. And I would suggest something that was sent to me recently by a friend who now is running Claire Matrix, was an article in the New York Times about the fact that a woman's son died at 20 years old. She started to look at what was it that failed in the system and started realizing that addiction is thought of as something very distinct from mental illness. So the doctors who were capable of treating mental illness wouldn't treat him because he had an addiction, and the doctors interested in addiction wouldn't treat him because he had a mental illness. And I would say after reading that, it sort of dawned on me that this mental obsession, this internal, anxious, inner conflict that's generated, I would say, is the source. Not only it's recognized as the source of all compulsive behaviors, but I would say it's also the source of all anxious disorders. And it doesn't mean we don't have predispositions coming into our bodies that are genetically based as a result of inherited dysfunctional capacities of the genes over generations and generations and generations. Since genes adapt, if we're causing stress on a constant basis, genes are going to adapt in ways that continue to promote that stress as a result of depleting aspects of our natural systems that just aren't available in the same way for everybody, that would normally and naturally be available. So I'm not discounting those predispositions, but that if within the thinking we're doing about the conditions we have, if we can make it worse by the thinking we're doing, certainly there's a chance to get better. Certainly it would suggest that there is a way to not do what we're doing that makes it worse. And if we stop doing what makes it worse, there would be a natural window of awareness that would start to see the freedom of being able to do things in a way that would allow us to get better. And that exercise, in my experience, comes from communication and being with other people and talking with other people and being open about those things that are typically thought of as embarrassing and shameful and filled with guilt, rather than simply discussing them in a way that allows us to see that if we are based on the same effective platform, if the structure of our bodies and the universe are all based on the same platform, then there's a good chance what we're doing wrong is the same as each other is doing, just as what would be right in our experience would be the same as everyone else. We may put different faces and times and places to it, or attach different times, places, and faces, but it doesn't mean those things are any different, because the fundamental essence of those potentials is the same for all of us. So we share it. And talking about it, in my experience, makes a big difference in being able to actually address it openly. So that's largely what we're here to do. This is an infant conversation in that regard, because if, in fact, the misdiagnosis of many of the disorders has been thought of as something distinct and separate from addiction, then a lot of the crusades within the industry that is helping people are actually separated and have been divided when the potential to unite them is possible. And I think it's pretty easy to see on our streets today and around the country in other ways that there is a huge mental health problem with people doing things that make no sense whatsoever, that are violent, that are aggressive, that are not helpful to other humans, and living in conditions that are absolutely beneath any level that would be considered sane, including for animals, and having those conditions thought of as somehow compassionate for those people, giving them more latitude to get worse and think somehow they'll miraculously get better when some long-term solution is eventually realized. That kind of mental thinking by the people who actually have homes suggests to me that the problem on the streets is not a homeless problem, it's a mental problem. And it doesn't exist only in the people suffering the most obvious addictions and compulsions, but it is included in the people making the policies that are allowing those people to get worse and claiming what they're doing is helping them get better. That's enabling. That is as much a disease of addiction as any of the other compulsions is. And we're seeing it and witnessing it in public as though it's going to someday help itself, and it's getting worse. And a good indication you've misdiagnosed a disease is that it gets worse. If you got a headache and do something about it, there's a good chance it'll get better. If you don't, there's a good chance it might get worse. And we're watching it get worse and claiming that somehow it's going to get better by spending billions and billions of dollars and not addressing people directly today with what can be done in a conversation. And I would say that's an illness, social ill, that society thinks somehow or another these big grand ideas will distract us from the simple things that can be done on a daily basis that we're all capable of doing. So doing that together is our aim in this discussion, and starting to look at it from a point of possibility and actuality rather than this presumptive distraction of pushing it aside and thinking somehow it'll get better if we don't pay attention. And while we're actually watching things that I would suspect hurt all of us to some degree, to even be witnesses to them. If we want to turn away from them, there's a pretty good indication that it's repulsive to us and difficult to understand, difficult to look at squarely. So if we do that together, there's a better chance we might do that in public in ways that are productive and helpful and start to open up a broader conversation of possibility rather than one that continues to reinforce the ideas that have obviously not worked long enough for conditions to be what they are today. So that's my monologue. And Les and I started a little early today, so we got a little head start, but whatever you guys want to talk about, I'm open to. And so far it's only men, so I say you guys accurately. You want to look at what we talked about, Les?
Sure. There are times when, so right now I'll call the mental obsession that I have, or the thinking or whatever, is that there are things that I know that I believe or feel I could or should be doing. I know they need to be done, and if they're not done, there are severe consequences for not doing them. And yet I feel either stuck, and I probably spend, it's like everything else, I spend more, it reminds me of my addiction. I spend more time thinking about wanting to change and stop than I do actually putting the action in to changing or stopping. So for me, the area that's significant right now, not that it means anything, but there are some work aspects and some things that if don't get done will have consequences for both the business and the clients. And the question is, why do I, I'll call it procrastination. I don't know that it's fear. I think the fear grows as the possibility of negative consequences increases. And it's and
Isn't it interesting?
I do know better.
Isn't it interesting? Isn't it interesting how much more willing we are to admit the fear when it's really huge compared to when it's subtle enough to recognize?
Well, yes, which is nice because then at least I'm not catastrophizing. I make the catastrophe.
But the catastrophe is inevitable if what you're doing now is denying there's fear attached to what you're doing and driving you in some way. Doesn't need to be egregious for it to be aware, to be conscious of it. And you were talking about starting and stopping, and you have a resistance to starting. My sense is when we know we're about to redo the same stupid thing we've been doing, and I'm not calling you stupid to say that maybe what you're thinking is stupid, or maybe what I think is idiotic when I think in terms that aren't accurate. What else would it be but not smart to start something that we know is going to be a repetition of something we've tried thousands of times and it's never worked, and we think the change we want is going to come from the same state of thinking that we're starting with, the old thinking, this thinking about the words you used. You were talking about starting and stopping. Let me make one point about that. All change is about starting and stopping. So everything you're doing is constantly changing. You're not talking about change. You're talking about change you'd rather see lead to a result you'd rather have. It's very different than actually talking about change, because you are starting and stopping all the time. So you're doing what you're doing accurately based on ideas that are inaccurate. Change is always a beginning and an ending, and always a starting and stopping. Always, 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 always. Everything is always changing, including our thoughts, always. Anything within the relative scheme of our experience is always starting and stopping, always. And it's simultaneous. It's too quick to even notice because it's too constant to even, it's just everything. If everything is doing it, then the one commonality that doesn't change is that everything is always changing, right? Which is an old philosophical insight. And the reason for that is that when everything is seen in total, everything being everything, it starts to reveal principles that don't seem obvious when we're thinking not of everything, but something that we're fixated on. So when we're looking at small bits and pieces, it seems like we're really struggling with the whole and struggling against the whole, but we're choosing to isolate our thinking to those little bits and pieces as though they're separate from the whole, rather than remembering that they're absolutely part of the whole and they're simply choices we're making, and we're not condemned to them. And if they're looping around and starting to create obsessive thoughts, that is evidence, that's a signpost that we're managing something that's a lie. It isn't true. It isn't real. We're refusing to allow what we're doing to be what we're doing by thinking it shouldn't be what we're doing. And when I set off thinking, the first thing you said wasn't so much I'd like to change everything, but you said, I'm not doing everything I can do. And I challenged you and said, you're absolutely doing everything you can do in those moments you think you're not doing everything. Because if that's what you're doing, that's what you're doing. That's all you can be doing. And as a start point to have a relationship.
Ain't working.
What's that?
My doing ain't working.
It is working, though. It's just working in a direction you don't want to have happen. And that's exactly what addictive thinking does. It creates a consequence we don't want to claim. And by not claiming it, we continue to foster the idea that the thinking is right, but we just need to think about the wrong thinking in a new way. And that inner conflict can't be resolved by continuing to repeat it. That's Einstein's comment about you can't fix a problem with the same thinking that created it. And so we do that, and then we act as though we're caught off guard, when in fact we've done this so many times, we think it's the only thing we can do. And when we think the only thing we can do is the thing we've always done, we're thinking about things incorrectly, because every moment allows us to do anything we want, anything we want. And if what we choose to do is the sick thing, it's interesting that we would think it's the only thing we can do. Even in the comment, think about people say, I have no other choice. Why would they argue about it even being a choice if they had no other choice? They're actually arguing for it not being a choice and using choice to excuse it. That there's a blatant conflict in language that we say often and don't even recognize that if it weren't a choice, we wouldn't be thinking about it as a choice. We would be just acting on it. There would be absolutely no, it would be an instinct, or it would be something that's happening that we're not thinking about at all, and yet it's still happening. Like the minerals being delivered to our muscles right now and the blood flowing and all those things that happen. We don't think about it at all. And yet the stress we create undermines all of those capacities because our body begins to actually endure a level of stress that's self-imposed as a result and consequence of the thinking we're doing. And all of those other things that happen so beautifully don't happen as beautifully because of what we're thinking. So my sense is, like you talked about procrastination, isn't it interesting that procrastinators never take credit for not procrastinating? They never put procrastination off. So if you take credit for it, you all of a sudden have no contempt to yourself by saying, I never put I'm really good at that. I'm excellent at procrastinating. That's unbelievable. I didn't even realize how much of a master I am at that. And think of it in terms that embraces it rather than something you're repelled by. And it ends up diffusing the conflict because that opposing voice in your head that's all make-believe no longer continues that argument about how can I stop procrastinating while we're procrastinating. The immediacy of it is the claim of it. It's the accuracy of it. But we haven't used each other beneficially enough to notice that very often the perspective of these things ends up in how we see each other in ways that are not accurate. I see other people with the contemptful behaviors that I'm not willing to admit I'm doing in my own thinking. And so I either see them as contemptful, or I thank them for offering me the insight they're giving me to see how contemptful I am, to make believe it's them rather than me and what I'm doing that I'm unwilling to look at and see. It's like the world I think I see is actually giving me a perfect image of the things I'm doing. And what I want to do is blame the world rather than stop and say, wow, if that's how I'm seeing the world, then I have a lot of thoughts about it that may not be true. They may not be accurate. They may be misguided. And to start on that basis and refuse to notice that now, in the moment where everything's happening that's happening, doesn't give me a very strong foundation to step off from and go anywhere that isn't going to repeat the same old thing that I'm sick and tired of, but obviously not tired enough and not sick enough to stop or want to look at accurately and say, wow, facing this is a little gut-wrenching because the anxiety that we've been building up will all of a sudden become obvious. And it will all of a sudden become obvious that you're really not doing what you think you're doing by denying what you're doing. You're actually causing health problems and mental health problems that are undeniable. And yet we go about it as though they're something we can avoid and distract ourselves from and run off into all the other compulsive behaviors that we create to be preoccupied with our attention rather than say, why am I always running into stuff that I want to feel better? Why do I always seem to want to feel better? Why not admit that I must feel pretty bad to constantly want to feel better?
So, Les, your topic really reminded me of a quote from Dale Carnegie. I'm sure you know this one, but it's remember, today is the tomorrow you worried about yesterday, right? So, and I love Jack's sort of the paradoxical little trick, mind hack intervention where, yeah, we're really good at putting things off. And sometimes, I don't know if it's true for you, but by putting it off, we kind of add more importance to that thing that we think we need to do, right? It's not important enough. Oh, it might just be a few things. And then that importance and anxiety and stress builds. So eventually kind of creates this critical mass. But by the time it creates a critical mass, it's too big. It's too much. It's too overwhelming.
Isn't it interesting that we want to escape it when it's something we can look at easily, till it gets to a point that we don't want to face it because it's become too much? In both cases, it's the exact same denial and the exact same defiance and the exact same defensiveness.
And we missed the mark, right?
Totally.
It's
Well,
like
because
there
the mark
that
is
little
missed.
boundary. That's not important enough, and then all of a sudden it becomes too overwhelming. And where was that point that we crossed?
To refine what you said too, Alex, and Alex is a doctor of psychology and understands and looks at this and works with people, but to think we're putting it off doesn't mean we're putting it off, because the impact of it is ever present. And we know that something's wrong that we think we're going to avoid facing by thinking we're not facing it, and that we can avoid it. The fact that we can even think we're not where we are and cannot be where we are is to think the impossible is possible. And if we think the impossible is possible, that means our thinking is largely thinking about things that are impossible. So if we're largely thinking about things that are impossible, what are the chances we're going to be doing things that are possible? And that's why, Les, in looking at the idea that I'm not doing all I can and reversing that and saying, how could I be doing any more or less than what I'm doing? And it must be what I'm doing and what I can do. It isn't because it's a reversal of language, but it's starting to see that the thinking that goes into resisting what we do is the thinking that continues to perpetuate the thing that we claim not to want to do. It's a setup. It's a trap of addiction.
Yeah, and the thinking that you're referring to, Jack, is negativity bias, which in simple terms, it means that we are much more motivated by the stick instead of the carrot, right? And example, I was driving the other day, listening to sports radio, and they were talking about, I think, the most successful athletes and coaches. They were talking about Belichick and how he never thinks about the wins. He always stays up and loses sleep over every single loss, right? So that's another sort of example of, being so preoccupied with a negative outcome.
Well,
that game we won, we figured that puzzle out. But it's the negative thing that drives us.
Well, and that negative is literally an attempt to negate what's happening. It's trying to say that what's happening isn't happening because I can think it's not happening, and then think because I'm thinking it's not happening, that it's not happening. And there again, it puts thinking in the driver's seat of reality and truth, which it can't be because it's a byproduct of reality and truth. Our bodies are subsequent. There was reality and truth in the universe well before bodies showed up that could think the way we do. So there's some evidence, some slight evidence at least, that thinking wasn't the creator of reality. And that we can either express reality by being honest about our experience, or we can make believe that we recreate reality and then live in a world that seems impossible because we're thinking in impossible ways, and then blame the entire world and universe. And you hear it all the time. Life is hard. Life is a struggle. Life is not hard, and it's not a struggle. What we think about it is hard, and what we struggle with is what we think about life. Life itself was doing just fine before we got here. It's never had an attitude. It's never been contemptful. It's always given us everything that it's given us and provides us somehow this little orb that we're floating around, spinning around in space on, in ways that seem to be reliable enough to constantly show up every morning and every night. And yet we get into these thought-provoking inner reactive conversations with ourselves. So there's at least two of us in our head, and there's probably more, thinking about our thinking about our thinking about our thinking, and wondering why we feel sick and tired. It's not a coincidence. And humanity has suffered from this. All of written history has shown that self-indignation and self-righteousness has led to the idea that the best thing we can do is arm ourselves and kill other people who don't think like us. It's a pretty sick. Nothing in nature does that. Nature tends to provide havens for its own. Tries to support what's going on. It doesn't mean that there aren't interactions that are vicious, because in the animal kingdom, animals eat each other. But that's part of the design. That's how it works. It's not the rule book we created. It was happening well before we started happening. So to think of it incorrectly is easy, but to miss the marks, to miss the consequences as being perfect roadmaps and perfect guidance systems and perfect written body language, signs, to miss those is to act functionally illiterate and wonder why we dysfunction all the time and seem not to be able to do what we want to do and not get where we want to go. We're doing it intentionally to support the contention, the idea we have that if we're willing to support that what we're thinking is true and real when it isn't, we're willing to go to any length to convene or to contrive an experience that appears to be nothing we wanted so that we can justify the continuation of that simple thought. And it's as simple as that. Any thought that we're maintaining that is inaccurate, that we think is accurate, that is wrong, that we think is right, or that is right, that we think is wrong. We've got an inner debate going on with a self that has no basis other than what we think of it. And I can assure you that when that's when the basis of our thinking is inner conflict and inner reactivity, we are not thinking very well of the self that seems to be part of that conversation. There's no way. Why wouldn't we feel alone and less than and low self-esteem? There's no esteem in that action. None. It's vacant. Just like a lie has no basis or substance. It's the whole point. It doesn't have any existence other than the insistence that it's true.
Well, in the spectrum between the polarities that you were talking about, Jack, seems like on the one hand we have the motivation and on the other we have the consequences. And somewhere in the middle along that path, we have the boundary that we cross, right? And as humans, oftentimes we are very polar in our thinking. It's, black and white, all or nothing.
But think of that, Alex.
And bad. So on the one hand, we're motivated. And then, oops, all of a sudden, when we didn't act on it, that motivation becomes a consequence.
Those notions, though, that we can be good and never bad, dismiss the idea that good is based on bad and that bad is based on good. That's that isolation of the totality of all things being total, and the idea that we can take an extreme position and maintain it. All it does is force us up against constantly having to think about it in a way that isn't true. And think of a lie. If a lie is only based on thinking it's true, a lie is only what it is by being what it cannot be. What kind of basis is that for something? That's like a huge number with no denominator. 0 is a denominator. There's nothing there. It looks like a big number, but 0 is the denominator. There's no substance to that thought. Nothing.
I think what you're touching on is a sort of the difference between Western thought and Eastern thought. A lot of times in Western thought, we have that binary thinking, the good and bad, sort of heaven and hell kind of a perspective. And in Eastern thought, it's more the yin and yang, the continuity of, that a part of good always involves a little bad, and vice versa, right? And that you can't be all good or all bad at the same time. And you can't know happiness without sorrow. So, but we're kind of getting really philosophical. I'm wondering if less on a practical level, what you're thinking about this conversation, and specifically circling back to, procrastination.
Well, just using the word procrastination to me means a lack of action. But now that Jack's mentioned it, I guess I should be fulfilled because I now have very active procrastination. A lot of what we learn in the program is, I'll go back to even Chuck C., new pair of glasses. Change nothing changes except my perspective. And what I find interesting and sometimes perplexing is that I have learned, or I have seen, and I have experienced in what happens when perspective changes and the physical or other actions I take as a result of the change or the evolution of my perspective. And yet I still will fall back to, I think that's why we talk about, I'll take a little sidebar. I firmly believed when I got into the program that, carrying on with my addiction or alcoholism would kill me. I did not perceive that my character defects or shortcomings would lead me back to my addiction. And now my life is full of dealing with my character defects or shortcomings. And those are the things that cause me the pain or stress or anxiety that can come. And one of the things that Jack does well is by, we always talk about being present, by there's only this moment and everything is the way it's supposed to be. And that the possibilities of what will happen in the next moment and the moment thereafter are endless. And the willingness, ability, perspective to take action or live the action that will come that better suits my being so that I am not anxious or fearful. We've talked about this, some fears are rational and justified. An animal attacks you, you're about to have a car accident, whatever. But a lot of my anxieties and fears, most of my anxieties and fears come from, the potential consequences of things that I do have an ability to, I won't say change, but have an influence on. Some things I don't. Those things I learn to accept. But the things that I do have the ability and don't do it is what really causes me the anxiety. I don't know if it's so much, I'm not big on whatever self-flagellation, but I do recognize that, the outcome of that for me, one of the things that I found interesting is I'm shorter tempered. I will, because I know that service is the ultimate good and service is the ultimate connection and service provides me with the ultimate fulfillment of purpose, that sometimes I will lean on looking at other people's issues and service to them rather than taking any appropriate action on myself. It's the got to put your life preserver on first, or your air mask in a plane situation. My willingness to talk about this is the desire to, I'd much rather feel good than to look good. And I recognize that by being vulnerable, even if it's inaccurate or untruthful, is the path to being less vulnerable and more content with the actions that I take or don't, regardless of consequence of results.
I think you're summing it up, though, Les, because if you're talking about vulnerability being misrepresented, you're creating vulnerability. You're not creating security. You're creating the impression of security. And that's, again, this idea that you don't like or don't self-flagellate would mean that you don't feel any consequence for the anxiety and stress that you're talking about actually feeling.
Actually, that's not it. That would be a lie.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. So The fact is that we have gotten, and I would speak broader than myself because I don't see this as something that happens to the individual. I think collectively we've been maintaining a conspiracy around this for a long time. We've been acting better than we feel so that we can pose to everyone else an idea that isn't true. So we can say, I got them all convinced, it must be true for me too. And why would we better ever try that if we didn't know something was wrong with that? We wouldn't bother. We wouldn't go to that great effort of constantly trying to pose in ways that have us feel better. But that point of feeling better about what we're doing that's worse is exactly the trap of addiction. Constantly trying to feel better is the admission that we feel worse without actually admitting we feel worse. Constantly focusing on the consequence and the symptom rather than on the source and the cause within the thought. So keep in mind that perspective, what I learned about perspective was that if I can broaden the perspective, a perspective always comes from a single point, right? It's always a V. There's a focal point where the person looking out is either looking narrowly or broadly. If my experience can be adjusted simply by thinking about it differently, it can be eliminated by seeing the possibility of not thinking about those things at all. Not requiring that focal point that I'm constantly looking from to try to convince myself what I see is okay. Rather than notice that the essence of our being isn't a focal point at all because there is no point in it. It isn't a spatially defined, time-based system. And I would challenge you a little, Alex, to thinking that if this is accurate, it isn't philosophical at all. It's just simply how things are, and it can seem extremely voluminous to even consider compared to the little bits of things we tend to focus on, but that doesn't make it philosophical if it's in fact accurate. It begins to actually replicate a conversation that addresses and reflects the nature of the universe as a metaphor. We talk about it as being huge, but if there's an infinite source, the universe is not huge at all. There's nothing that could be big enough to be huge next to what's infinite. Nothing. And if the universe is only finite, and I would say because it's always expanding, it's always finite at whatever point it's expanding to, that's exactly like the idea that if we broaden our perspective, we're seeing things differently. But if we're seeing them from the same point, all we're seeing them is a new way of the same old point, and we're going to repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and repeat it and just say, well, that's who I am. And it isn't who we are. It's what we're thinking. So if our essence is greater, and you have a knowing awareness, Les, everyone does. You can't, if it's infinite, it can't be escaped. And it also can't condemn us. What we try to escape is always contempt. And contempt isn't a part of anything infinite. It's a part of what we make out of what's finite, our human experience. It's what we create. And if that's what we're creating, that's an interesting thing that we would bother to do something so petty and so pitiful and so sad and demoralized and wonder why we grieve over loss of things that we've really not lost at all, or not achieving what we wanted and not realize how many other opportunities on that same path that we never expected came along that we dismissed and never even bothered to notice. If all we think should happen is what we think, then out of all possibilities, all we're imagining is a couple of opportunities compared to billions and trillions of other potential combinations. And again, that seems obscene, but I would suggest it's absolutely true. And it's absolutely the nature of our existence. And if it weren't, why would we be struggling so desperately as a species? Why wouldn't we feel great about all the corruption and the pollution and the contamination and the anger and hostility and confrontation and violence? We would think that's our high point because our basis would be corrupt and irresponsible. But I don't suspect it is. I suspect we are responsible and we know when we're wrong. We very clearly know it, and we just don't always admit it because we leap on that bullet train that's running. Reality doesn't repeat itself. It's always new. It's always static in one regard, but always new in every other regard. It's always all possibilities possible all the time. Always, for everybody. That bullet train of that thinking that goes around and around and around and thinks that it's departing the station, yet it's heading right back to the station, is tiring. It's what anxiety and stress is. It's an awareness. That anxiety and stress is the self-flagellation. It is the consequence. It's an absolute consequence that our body is built to tell us something here is wrong. And you might want to look at it. Doesn't say you have to. Doesn't say stop here. Don't go any further. I'm going to glue your feet to gravity until you start listening. Doesn't say that because it's generous and kind and loving. It doesn't interfere with our own choices. We do. We do that. Collectively, we do that when we don't confront what other people are thinking and saying and pat people on the back and say, don't worry, you're going to be okay. Keep thinking insane thoughts and you're just going to be great and fine. And then everybody says, God, I didn't even know he had suicidal thoughts. What do you mean he killed himself? What do you mean he overdosed? He hadn't had a drink in 20 years. We act surprised. It isn't a surprise. It's happening around us right now. It's happening with us. To any degree we're maintaining those ideas, we're trying to ignore what's happening out there because it would point a little too closely what's happening in here. If everything that's possible is possible, one thing that's possible is that we have no obligation to repeat what we always thought was the only possibility. And it doesn't tend to come quickly because the unraveling of those stories takes a minute to say, oh my God, I keep leaping into these. Think of the stories we tell about the impossibilities of doing it any differently. And they always come in this kind of form. We always have these clever little narratives that support it and create this form to it. Well, my relationship and this and that, all of a sudden you've got this little story going on like a play on a stage. And we reinforce those and reinforce those and reinforce those and reinforce. And pretty soon we think we're just a characterization following a script and wondering.
We're so bought into that story that we have to play it out now.
Well, we think it's our life and our life depends on continuing. That's exactly what a lie relies on. Constant
and that
focus.
There's a stress involved and anxiety involved about switching or leaving that narrative, leaving that story and going to something else.
And isn't it interesting?
How dare I?
Interesting though,
story.
Alex, that the fear that's telling us that something's wrong and the pain we then use again to justify continuing to do the thing that's wrong and painful.
Mm-hmm.
That's addiction.
We're afraid of that little bit of pain to switch that narrative. And that pain or the fear of the pain bounces us right back to continuing that same story over and over and over.
So what's interesting about that, we say we're afraid of the pain while we're actually growing it by denying it. At the same moment we're claiming we're afraid of the fear and afraid of the pain, we're actually making it worse, thinking we're getting better. Think how twisted that has to be and how nervous. We have about 38 miles of nerves in our body. So we have a lot of nerve, literally.
You got the nerve, Jack.
But if we have all that capacity to charge that nervous system with anxiety based on something that's simply and only happening in our thinking, and our body takes it seriously enough to say, look, I'm just going to go with what you choose. I'm not going to argue with you. I am here at your disposal. I will do what you want. That's all it does. But yet it's saying, I'm giving you good information here if you're willing to stop and notice what you're doing. If you're willing to look at it at all, I'm giving you really good information. And this anxiety that you're feeling is an absolute reflection, just like you're standing in a mirror with a mask, a horror mask on, and wondering why you're afraid, thinking it isn't you, thinking it's not something you're doing, that the mirror's out to get you. It's so simple and so quick and so immediate because we're chronically retelling in our own thinking these stories about things that are absolutely not true and missing. The moment has no narrative to it. None. There is no story in the present moment. None. There's nothing wrong but what we bring into it in our thinking, and that still doesn't make the moment wrong. It just makes us think it's wrong, and that's the preoccupation of mentally obsessive thought.
Well, we're also meaning-making machines, and we want to connect, the now, this now with the previous now with the now before that, and all of a sudden we are continuing that narrative.
That's the story.
I agree. that this moment doesn't necessarily have to have that continuity. It doesn't have to, fit that narrative.
Yes.
Right
yes.
now
So
is where we have the choice of going and switching to something completely different.
seeing that, Alex, even as a consideration of philosophy, just considering that maybe, just maybe, not even agreeing, not believing, not having faith, not having trust, not absolutely being sure, but simply suggesting that maybe the possibility exists that I don't ever have to redo anything I've ever done before, and then go to the moment and say, oh, I've never had to do it. What would have me continue to do this but something sick? To constantly make believe the only thing I can do is the thing I used to do, I did, and someday it will get better. That's the failure of addiction, of thinking it will get better some other time, but never now. And when is everything happening? Now. It is never happening at any other time than now. So what's the impossibility?
If it's a sick part of me that's making that decision right now.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. It's a sick thought. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
That's
now,
all we have to do.
Should we not do that? Well, if we're doing it, I would say it's what we should be doing. If that's what we're doing. But when you take, like Les, you said that I say that everything is as it's supposed to be, which I don't say, I don't include supposed in that, because supposed is a presumption. And what I say is that everything is as it is, supposed or not. Who knows? I don't want to get into all that. I don't need. What I can say accurately, and my job in my world, as far as I can tell, is just to continue to peel off some of the layers of conversation that that I've developed that aren't true, that are simply not true, and start speaking in terms that are more accurate. So I don't see it as something supposed. I see it simply as it is. And it's easier to concede that things are certainly what they are, as they are, when they are, than thinking about them as something that should or shouldn't be happening. And my sense is that the should or shouldn't is all value judgment based in thought. It's not the universe condemning us or holding us in contempt. It's simply us creating what we see as the world by limiting what we think to ideas that we think are real and true, and all of a sudden become the creators of reality and truth. And that would put ego in the seat of the throne of God, which is a major conflict if there's actually something supreme to thinking in any way. If there's a knowingness that's absolute, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, if there's some present knowingness, certainly doesn't rely on our thinking, and it would have existed well before we started thinking. So it's some indication that our thinking is subsequent to it and not in charge of it, that's the charge, that beingness is the essence of our existence and the essence of the basis of that's our source, rather than thinking being the source. Good morning, Philip. So part of this, rather than think of what we're doing as what we shouldn't be doing, is to start simply conceding that if we're doing what we're doing, for whatever the reasons are, we don't even have to get into it, the whys, the wheres, the hows, the whats, none of it. If we're doing what we're doing and our experience is the experience we're having, then there's a good chance the experience is an accurate reflection of what we're doing. And if we feel bad and we feel wrong, there's a good chance it isn't the feeling that's the problem, that the feeling is accurately assessing the thinking that's a problem. And if we're willing to look at it and take a breath around that and just start saying, wow, what happened for me is I started crying a lot more. I started realizing the amount of pain that I had heaped on my shoulders and caused thoughts about that had everything to do with everything else, the world being pitiful and sick and all demented and impossible and all. It had nothing to do with any of that at all. And I realized how much pain I had been resisting and fighting and defying and denying. And it just started to, I thought of it like an iceberg melting as it comes up in the ocean. As the top is exposed from the water, it tends to melt a little quicker because it's exposed to the either colder or warmer temperature. Either it freezes up or melts. But that tears are salty. And I just thought of it as like ice melting. And that melting, the ice, was very much a cover, a defense, an insulation, a desensitization to my experience of what was happening around me, because I was so fraught with pain and suffering and anxiety and reactiveness that I did everything I could to avoid those things, to make believe they weren't happening. And that was really my preoccupation. That was my full-time job. Everything else I did as a job seemed laborious because they were secondary to this preoccupation with trying to fight everything, and then look like I was managing life okay, while I was actually demented in my thinking, and I was barely capable of being productive in any manner, except the least, which had me break even for years. Just get by. And I always thought, oh, there's just too little out there for me. Another reflection of too little in my thinking about what was actually happening. So what did I do? Created a world that looked that way. Why? Because I was unwilling to notice what I was doing and pay the attention that I had to what was actually happening, rather than consume all my attention with thoughts about what weren't happening. And it's a revelatory experience to start noticing how much we've been denying when we start to look and say, wow, I've been lying about things that haven't been true for a long time. And I've been holding myself hostage. I'm both the hostage taker and the ransom maker. And the ransom is all the deficiencies that I experience about myself, that I think less than and think I'm an idiot and think all those things, rather than just saying, no, I'm doing some pretty idiotic things, but it doesn't make me an idiot. It just means I'm thinking idiotically, and as a result, performing idiotic actions. It's an expression. It's not necessary. It's just a choice. Thoughts?
I often hear it said, and I often feel that you get your greatest growth or change through pain, the experience of discomfort, pain, or whatever. That may be true, because probably focus on it more, just like what Alex was saying about Bill Belichick. But I don't know that the change comes about because of the pain. I do think that as a result of like this conversation that we're having discussion, that I like the idea that whatever I'm thinking, or whatever possibilities I may think there are, I'm being very limited in that. And therefore, by opening up the possibilities of what I can do or what will happen, is actually a open door to not having future pain. And I don't say doing things differently, but thinking and acting in a way that will lessen, if not alleviate, the lies that we tell ourselves, or I tell myself.
Yeah. Well, within that range of possibility is that we start doing what we used to do in a new way based on what we used to do, and think it's different and better, so that we're constantly reworking, like you talked about, restarting just a new cycle that's based on the same thinking, rather than just begin to concede that thinking is not our source. We have a knowing presence that's intuitive. Big Book talks about pain being the touchstone of spiritual growth. Pain is an indication that something's wrong. That's what pain is. It's saying something's wrong. Pay attention over here. If what we're doing is trying to manage the pain and get rid of the pain, we're not dealing with the problem it's causing. Just like if you had something wrong with your kidney and you were hurting and said to the doctor, I feel fine. He's not going to know to look. They're not going to know to check. And the longer you postpone that awareness, the better the chance that disease is going to create cataclysmic consequences to finally get your attention. So the thinking about the thinking, as you begin to notice it and just see that it's never going to serve you until you begin to see what it is and recognize that the subtleties don't need to lead to pain to be obvious because they're uncomfortable immediately. That discomfort that we feel, that anxiety, that stress are all indications that we're doing something in our thinking that's wrong. Unless there's a legitimate external fear, threat, and I would say 99% of our lives or more has never experienced that sort of threat. For the most part, we've never, we drive and take for granted that everything's going to be fine. It's one of the most dangerous things we do every day. We're inches from death and act like it's never going to happen. And I'm not suggesting focusing more on death is better, but acknowledging the risks is certainly a level of prudence that would give us better driving habits than some of the things we do because we're late or think somebody else is driving bad, so we end up doing the same thing they're doing or just act in ways that seem oblivious to what's going on around us. That sort of insulation from what's happening has us desensitized to our awareness that we're at risk. It's not helpful in the long run. That's why we call them accidents. We want to disclaim responsibility, but they're not accidents. They're consequences of choices. So part of this, and the letting go, as I've mentioned before, when I began to realize what ego was, I had a panic attack. And I had only had 2 of those in my life. I'd been stabbed by a guy and never had a panic attack over it. But when I started noticing that everything I'd thought about myself wasn't real and it wasn't true, it was just thoughts, my body seized up with all of the fears and anxieties and all of the doubts and uncertainties and things that I had stored, thinking I could pretend they're not there by denying them. They lit up like a candle, like a headlight, like a locomotive. And it was interesting, gripping to say the least. I thought I was dying. And in a sense, I was. That thinking of mine died that day. And the consequences of that was actually a release of that pain and a release of that anxiety and a letting go of those things without even thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about it. I was actually just witnessing the terror that I had held on to and the horror that I had held on to for so long. And it dissipated as I looked at it, and I just kept breathing. I kept saying to myself, I am as I am, I am as I am, I am as I am. I thought I was having a heart attack. I thought I was dying. But it was all self-induced and all an opportunity to see the accumulation of those things I had denied over decades and made believe weren't true and conceded that they weren't true. They were just ideas, but the consequences of those were very physical and very much I was aware of them, and I realized I'd been aware the whole time. I'd just been a master at denial, a master at the cunning, baffling nature of being able to pretend what's happening isn't happening. And that dissipation is natural. Just like the sunlight and fog, it just evaporates. The warmth of that attention, the warmth of that awareness, the warmth of that gaze in a way that's actually not resisting. It's not that cold, hard resistance. It's an embracing of what's happening. Allows things that aren't real and true to dissipate from the place we've kept them through our own opposition, our own persistent resistance to what's happening. Our own insistence of persistently resisting creates a sense of persistence and a sense of reality. It isn't real. It just seems real because it hurts. And hurt, again, is not a sign of reality. Hurt and pain is a sign something's wrong. It's a road sign, a body language. Functional literacy is noticing how we're functioning and being accurate in those assessments, and be willing to concede that maybe the conclusions we make that are so cocksure aren't cocksure at all, but being driven by the new way of avoiding what we have largely not wanted to address and look at and talk about.
I think at the outset you said all action is preceded by a thought.
Yes. And thoughts and action.
Yeah.
All voluntary outward action is always preceded by a thought. And if you watch, just to practice a little bit in terms of exercise, just notice that whenever you're thinking, you're always where you are. You're never somewhere else. Even when you're thinking you're somewhere else, you're always where you are thinking you're somewhere else. So it sort of confirms this present seeming theory, which I would say isn't a theory, it's just a fact. It's just, we're always where we are. We've always been where we are. And thinking we're not gives us the impression we're not. But the impression we're getting is depressing eventually, because the weight of that thought is a form of resistance, which is why it's an impression, why it's depressing. That resistance creates impressions and depression as a result, the longer we hold it. It's natural.
I don't think it's that I'm not where I'm at. I'm thinking I don't like where I'm at.
I know. But think of the fact that you think it has any difference?
No, anxiety is anxiety, depression is depression, fear is fear. So
what I'm saying, though, is if you don't like where you are, who gives a shit? Yes, exactly. Exactly. So you are setting up a situation for you to live in a state of dislike over something that's absolutely the way it is. You are where you are. What's the difference whether you like it or not? It's irrelevant to how you, if you are unwilling to accept you're simply there, you will not create the freedom that you have in your next action to take the steps. You said, when I see possibility is greater, I can have greater possibility. Let me assure you, possibility is always possible no matter what you think. So I'm giving you a little relief here. We constantly return to thinking we have to do something to achieve the nature of our existence, when in fact the nature of our existence is always possible, regardless of what we think. And the point I'm trying to make is that thinking often intercedes in giving us ideas that are not true to continue the furtherance of maintaining ideas that aren't true, out of the same desperation that gives us the impression that if we stop, we're going to die. That our life depends on maintaining these things, that who we are is so built up in what we think. It's not true. So liking it or not is irrelevant. And then when you realize it's irrelevant less, you can like it or not and start doing something about that without feeling like you have to dismiss how it is, because you'll start being aware of the fact that if you don't like it, why would you have it that way if you didn't really like it? I would suggest you like exactly the way that it is, because being a truthful being, you would rather actually face things truthfully and simply haven't learned what that means, nor has society or culture. So why wouldn't we have bad examples to follow by everyone else and think, well, everybody else does it, I might as well go too. Do the same thing. So if it's always possible, no matter what you think, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. And it doesn't mean you can't not like it or have to like it. There's no requirement. But if you have it the way you have it, I would suggest to you, you want it that way because you're waiting to get your attention to actually align yourself with what's happening, rather than the fomenting of this disconnect, discontent, and irritable state of restlessness, trying to constantly rework the wrong thing and think someday it will be right.
No, I think things are happening and I'm anxious because whatever my thoughts are, I'm not taking action to.
That's constructive.
That's correct.
Okay. So if your basic thought is destructive, you're going to act on that basic thought in destructive ways. That's the point of this. And you don't have to think you're thinking destructively to look at what you're doing and say, I must be, if the subsequent actions are not constructive. Right? So that's the literacy portion of it, is starting to actually look at what's happening and let it be a perfect guide, like a textbook or a roadmap, GPS. Because if what is happening and how we think about it is getting in the way of what we're doing, then we may well be thinking wrong about what's happening. And to simply concede that, what happened in my experience was that I began to realize that almost everything I think about anything is wrong, because it's all an interpretation. It's all what I think about it, not what it is. And it started to help me see that things are what they are without me. And it gave me a chance to observe them without the immediate concoction of judgment and all that other stuff that I had in the conversation. I just started looking at things, saying, wow, the sky is blue. It's just blue. I don't know if it's big or vast or good or bad. It's just blue today. Simple. And look at the most obvious thing rather than the most complex thing I can generate in some convoluted way to come up with some new theory that gives me this long-term version of how I'll straighten things out by complicating or twisting them. It's interesting that we think we're going to straighten things out by twisting them further. So our thinking is not trustworthy if we think we're not where we want to be, if we think we're not in the present, if we think we should be somewhere else. Those are not trustworthy efforts. Those are all misguided efforts. They're all lies. They're all attempts to make believe. Make believe is in fact reality and truth. Morning, Jackie and MK.
Morning.
Well, if everything is the way it is,
Yes.
And thinking obsessively or thought often is a limitation and an inaccurate belief in reality, that it's reality.
Yeah.
How do we, by having the acceptance of that everything is the way it is and should be, how do we get into action or do things or be differently so that we don't feel anxious, depressed, or fearful?
If I just go to the book, it says we'll intuitively know how to handle things that used to baffle us. What used to baffle me is why I kept relying on the same old thinking it would fix things, while it proved itself over and over and over again to create the problem. So if intuition is intuition, intuition is knowledge beyond reason. What does that mean? It takes no good reason to be knowledgeable.
So I act only on intuition and not thought.
Well, you begin to recognize, again, it isn't dismissing thought. Thought's designed to express what we know. That's its purpose, to express what we know, not what we think we know. And yet, we're certainly allowed, given the freedom that an absolute knowing source that isn't vulnerable and isn't at risk and doesn't feel offended because we don't go along with it, we can be maligned in our thinking, and as a result, think and do things that are maligned. And we're good at that. We've been masters at that. It isn't to say we shouldn't do that. And if you start looking at the word should, it condemns you immediately to whatever you're doing being something you shouldn't be doing. Well, if what you're doing is what you're doing and what is happening, it's apparently what's happening. Whether it should be or not is irrelevant. It's just happening. Simpler than wondering whether it should or shouldn't be. Should or shoulds are just decisions about what we like or don't like. They're preferences. And what's interesting is we don't notice that we really like what we don't like. We almost have a stronger commitment to what we don't like. If you talk to people largely and ask them what they like, they'll generally tell you what they don't like. So there's greater certainty in what we don't like than typically what we like, because we're always exploring and finding new things that we like. And yet the reinforcement of the old things we don't like tends to be pretty consistent. I don't like this. I hate this about people. I hate people who hate. There's great insurance in what we see in wrong in others, and not as great assurance in seeing. Good morning, Jackie.
Hi. I wanted to add to that because I went to the Banksy exhibit and I love Banksy, but after a while I was just like, what does Banksy like? Like, I know Banksy hates consumerism, Banksy hates politics, Banksy hates guns and war, which I do too, but it's like, all right, now what is Banksy like? So I started just like screaming out like, Banksy loves Real Housewives with attitude. But anyway, yeah. But it's nice, like what you like is nicer energy and feels better than what I hate.
Just remember, we feel what we don't like condemns us. It doesn't. It's a fucking choice. All we do is come up with decisions in thought about things. And if I preoccupy myself with thinking I know what I don't like, I limit those. Normally, the person I learn the most from is the one I think the least of. Because they always, when they open their mouth or do something, exceed my limited expectations. Almost always.
Right.
And
they're your biggest teachers, my mother.
So why am I listening to you, Jack?
You should hang out with my mother, Jack.
I like you. I think a lot of you.
Look, I am not exempt from the possibility of doing these things. And the freedom of this is not seeing how we can't or shouldn't do it. The freedom of this comes from the neutrality of realizing it's always possible for us to do and begin to think in those terms. The book says that we were taken to a place of neutrality. Sobriety and recovery is beginning to see that we can think about anything and we have no compulsive need to do it. We have no requirement to act on it, none, because it's just a thought. When I think I can't think about it, now I've created a compulsive experience that I'm going to act out on. And to look at all the little things we get hung up on with the day is to, in any given day, is to see how many compulsive traits we've been expressing in our day. All those little hooks, those little fish hooks that we get stuck in thinking about that sort of rotate in our brain are all attachments to compulsions that we've found other things to justify what we're doing rather than conceding what we're doing is what we're doing rather than using other things to justify them. The evaporation of this is not the fight over it. It's the neutrality and saying that choice is a choice because it always allows us not to choose, always. That principles are principles in the affirmative way, in the way that affirms life and sobriety and sanity, just like principles of evil are principles. You know, this Herbert Spencer quote in the Big Book, that there is a principle. Let me see if I can find it and read it really quickly. I have not yet memorized it. There is a principle which is a bar to all information, an argument against all something. Forgetting, this is now from memory. That principle is contempt prior to investigation. It can keep a man in everlasting ignorance, is what he says. So that's a principle, but it's not the kind we're talking about promoting. It's one that's an option. That option of being contemptful before we even investigate is basically the idea that we know all we need to know, and we're going to make a decision and fight for the limits of that decision at all costs. And that thinking is emblematic of stress and anxiety, and I would suggest anxiety disorders, because when we do it chronically, our body starts breaking down. And think about the disorders as they're defined: manic depressive, extreme positions in both directions, obsessive compulsion, extreme thinking, extreme actions. bipolar. It's a bi-separation of polarization. It's an attempt to make believe that one thing can be true, but not the other. When good is good, it's exclusive from bad. That is not true. It's based on bad. Good is not bad. Bad is not good. They're based on it. The common ground in between them. Opposites attract because they're connected. They're not apart. They've never been apart. They only appear to be apart because our forms are designed to see things as forms, not as substantive. But our being is substantive and knows things substantively, not in forms. Forms are just projections, like a movie. And in our own movie, we think we die at the end, yet we go to the movies and don't think the actors and actresses die when the movie ends. So the immediacy of the present is always available, always accessible, always each of ours and all of ours simultaneously. We are never anywhere other than there, and there isn't even a there because it's not a sliver of space or time. It's just an ever-present newness that's always possible. Everything is always possible, whatever's possible. And it's even possible to think impossibility is possible within that range of possible, which is what sets us off in these mental benders. All mentally obsessive thought is thinking about are things that aren't true. Why? Because lies only exist in thought. And they don't even actually exist as anything other than what thoughts insist on thinking. And that's the compulsive nature of this repetitious thinking. It doesn't create reality. It just feels real when it's all we're doing and all we're thinking about. Because our experience becomes consumed by it, because we're thinking about things that aren't happening, we're ignoring the things that are happening, and life seems very small as a result, and not very worthwhile, and not meaningful, and not purposeful, and not valuable. And life doesn't have to be any of those things to be life anyhow. But certainly creating value seems to be beneficial to not only each of us, but all of us. And being constructive tends to have benefits for everyone, not just me, not just you, all of us. And being destructive tends to be difficult for everyone else. We've mastered the one end. We don't seem to be interested in talking about the other one honestly enough to start to see that our nature is actually productivity, responsibility, constructive expression, and full expression of the awareness that we absolutely know. That's our design. Or order. I don't know, design, order. Sobriety is about sanity, and sanity is not about insanity. Sanity is a natural state of being compared to something. Insanity is always limited to thought and brains, not beingness. So that awareness, if we have it less, we grieve the lack of expressing it because we witness the missing of the point and feel like we're distant from reality and end up feeling disconnected from it. It's a self-imposed, self-induced state of awareness. Nothing more, nothing less. Not to use your name in vain, but
No, it's actually quite appropriate at times.
I always used to say less is more. So if we have that knowing awareness and we don't talk about it very readily, and often getting to that point creates silence, which I would say is an accurate assessment of that pondering and just thinking, what does that even mean if we have an absolute awareness? What does that mean to me now? What does that mean to me in relation to all the things I'm doing? And my experience is it made a lot of what I'm doing make a lot less sense because a lot of what I was doing was just trying to cover my ass to keep ahead of the defensive posture that I'd been maintained, to make it look good enough and just basically stay ahead of the tsunami that I was building behind me, making believe it wasn't there as it was growing. And a lot of that stuff started to change. My relationship to it changed. My investment in it changed. My ideas about it changed. And still today do. What's the point of being here if we're simply trying to escape what we're doing and create a life that's built around having it look like we're not doing what we're doing? Sturgis, good morning. Morning, Matt.
Morning. I thought it was interesting how you define sanity versus insanity, that sanity includes a state of being as compared to insanity as only in thought.
Yes. So lies only exist in thought, Les. Lies are a human condition. They're not, animals don't go around saying, I know I look like a zebra, but I'm a tiger and don't fuck with me. Animals basically do what they do. Atoms do what they do. They don't argue. They don't contest. They interact or they interreact according to exactly the way that they're designed. We don't. When we're lying, we interreact in ways that try to condemn other people for the condemnation we're creating in our own thinking. And that historically has been the, Katie and I saw, what was it? The Iliad at the Broad once, and they read off every war that humans had been involved in. Took 45 minutes. And there were 390 wars through history that were recorded. Some lasting decades, some still going on, that have defined human history. That's a pretty good indication that we're fairly deficient in our capacity to express something that would unite us if we're constantly fighting over what divides us. Most of the social issues are all about fighting. And none of those fights have ever been won. They just kept getting redefined and redefined. It's new people, new faces, making a new fight against something that's unjust. But the lack of justice is seeing it as something separate from everyone. So a new group gets some special attention and another group is sitting completely unrecognized, because it's not a unifying effort, it's a divisive effort. And conflict is always based on divisiveness, never based on unity. That's why in the program, surrender, every army that ever surrendered was the one that actually brought peace, not the one that won. The surrender precedes peace. The fight maintains the lack of peace. And yet, what do? Give credit to the victor. They fought for peace. They preserved peace. No, they just set up the next war. They just set up the next tee for the next ball, go into the hole that's never found because the fairway just keeps getting over the horizon. It just keeps getting pushed down the line, thinking someday this will all sort itself out, rather than stop and say, this makes no sense. This is insane that we would even think that way, and make believe that somehow we can't talk about it in ways that are accurate and need to be patriotic and have some agenda that fulfills this expectation that every country should fight for itself, without noticing that it's a losing proposition. And it's the exact same thing we do in our own little worlds that is actually connected to the entire world and universe, galaxies, all of it. Why? It doesn't really matter. If we're doing it, we're doing it. But I would say it's probably not healthy, and probably why we have so many mental illnesses and so little attempt to be able to actually solve it. It's pretty glaring right now in our country. I don't know around the world what's going on, but I suspect even in the points that Alex was making about the Asian cultures, the Asian cultures have been some of the greatest warring cultures in history. That even in the midst of thinking in ways that are very different than the way we think, they manage to figure out who the enemy is and dominate them pretty well. It's pretty assured that there's something in that thinking that's pretty similar to what we're doing. And it's even rearing its head today in our political storm.
My yin is bigger than your yang.
Yeah. So it's gone on a long time, and it goes on for us every day to the degree that we pretend it doesn't. And it's no different on the grand scale, the macro scale, as it is on the micro scale, on each of our individual. If my responsibility in being here is for what I'm doing to start with, and what I'm doing is corrupt, I am fostering the corruption that goes around the world by giving the impression it's the only thing we can do to other people who are looking for an excuse, rather than speaking in terms that are accurate, rather than not just speaking up, speaking, period. I don't need to speak up or speak out to speak. And having a conversation based on principles, which is what sobriety is about. And sobriety, by the way, means health. And health is sanity. Certainly not perpetuating disease. And as you described earlier, Les, a lot of recovery is just a reawakening to the problem and the thinking that's going on. And the awareness of that grows with sobriety. When the compulsions are relieved and the distractions aren't as big as they were when they consumed all our attention, we have attention to start paying to the fact that there are issues going on that aren't right now. And every day there's something that comes up that I'm not quite prepared to deal with in the most effective manner. If there's a being nature that's infinite, it does not abide by our rules, our dictates, our limitations. It never has. It's simply an ever-present nature that we all have right now, wherever we are, always. And to simply begin to consider that relieves the thinking that goes into making believe that there isn't something any greater than our thinking. Just the contemplation of it. If you think 2 + 2 might be 4, you're a lot closer to solving that problem than if you think 2 + 3 = 4. The simple consideration of anything accurate begins to allow the awareness of that accuracy to become more evident. Exactly like considering things that aren't true to be true gives us immediate discomfort and disturbance and dis-ease, literally a lack of ease. It doesn't take time. It only takes time. Time is equal to the amount of denial we want to buy into before we finally admit it. And there's no requirement for that.
I appear to have a lot of time then.
Yes. Well, it's interesting too that people talk about being afraid of death, and yet they like doing things that are fun where time flies. So one thing that's sure is that when you're willing to face pain, time seems to go really slow. So if you ever wanted to have what seemed like a longer life, ultimately pain would do that. Give you the impression, right? Because time bends. Time isn't fixed in terms of its speed.
You brought up pain. There was a line in John Lennon's song. Anna heard it. She goes, "Well, did you hear that?" And we've heard this song dozens of times. And she's like, "Did you hear what he said?" I go, "No." And I looked up the lyrics, and he says, "God is a concept by which we measure our pain." And I was like, whoa. Okay. I didn't know how to feel about that. I'm still processing what he was trying to say, but clearly he said exactly what he was trying to say.
Yeah. Some of you weren't here, where I found some quotes this past week from Goethe, one of which was, "The greatest evil that can befall man is the thought that he or she should think ill of himself." That includes herself. So think of that. The greatest evil. Goethe is a pretty big thinker in history, pretty wise in a lot of what he came up with. The greatest evil, what does that mean? Each of our responsibility is to look at whether we're expressing principles of evil or principles of love. Are we passing on our experience in ways that benefit others, or simply giving them a greater excuse to face their own pain and suffer further by not always knowing how, heaping more on them so that sense of overwhelm becomes impossible to ever confront, or seemingly? Those are questions worth probably looking at. And if our nature is so generous as to allow us to make believe that what's impossible is possible, and that we can live an entire life making believe that all we think the world is and the universe is, and whatever that supreme power is what we think, that's a pretty loving source to give us so much freedom to begin to decapitate ourselves literally in terms of our own capacity to use our brains in ways that are meaningful, purposeful, thoughtful, and generous, constructive. My experience is the silence is often consideration. This whole process is literally a ultimate recognition that our natural state of meditation and prayer is our natural state. And all of our choices are our prayers. Every one we make, we're praying for the consequence that we get to reassure us that we have a place, to overcome any doubt. But what do we tend to do in the sick thinking? Think it's not what we wanted, and start the whole cycle of making believe that we're not where we are, shouldn't be where we are, we need to be somewhere else, when you know what? We've never been anywhere else, and we're never going to be anywhere else than where we are. And if we think in accurate terms, it begins to eliminate a lot of that other inaccurate thinking quickly. And if you're noticing the racing thoughts and noticing the palpitations and noticing the anxiety, it's simply a road sign, a concession. It's a generous function of our body to tell us we're thinking something that's wrong. That's it. And if you settle on nothing more complicated than that, you'll start having a relationship with what you're doing that is peaceful and caring and willing enough to embrace what's happening, rather than thoughtless and uncaring and repulsive and opposing to what's happening, trying to pretend it's not happening. That whole attempt starts with a single thought, followed by a single thought, followed by a single thought. And it's always happening in the present. And the seeming subconscious that we have isn't sub at all. We're aware of it, and it's acting on us. And it's a place we tend to hide things that we think we want to claim irresponsibility for, and wonder how we can end up doing things that we call stupid and feel embarrassed about, when in fact we deny that we're even aware of it. And if we put the things there to hide them, we know that they're there. And one good way to see it is look at all the opinions you have about the world. They're all revelations of how you're thinking about things you don't think you're thinking of, and you need the world to justify it so you can start to see what you're thinking and look back on it and have some perspective. In all respects, it's never any different, no matter how many ways we color it, shade it, shape it, form it. It's always the same.
I find myself a lot this week when I'm contemplating something. It's always them, it's never me. Just kind of sum it up there. It's always them, it's never me. So when I hear somebody complaining about something that they're dealing with, I just say, it's always them, it's never me. And they're just like, huh? I'm like, well, listen to what you're saying. It's them. And then even if you're talking about another person, it's I don't know, it's resonating with me much more now, because I'm working with a decent sized group, and I hear all the lies that they're telling themselves when it comes to issues or client stuff. And I just go, wow, yeah, always them, never me.
Well, the good news about that is that they're telling you and giving you a chance to see the things you're continuing to maintain simultaneously, to even notice it. because the repelling nature of what others are doing is the repulsive nature of the self we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
that's why I hear that's why it stands out to me so much. I'm like, there's that one again. Done that before.
Well, I would say you're doing it when you're even seeing it to be seeing it, because otherwise the awareness would be, that's just chatter. That's just somebody talking. That's just more thought. It's just, the sting of it is the awareness that we're still being stung, and we're still in it a little bit and somewhere. It doesn't have to be a lot to be any. We think of getting better by doing it less, but if we're admitting we're still doing it and thinking that still doing it is okay, when in fact, as you get clearer, a speck of dust weighs a ton compared to initially pretending the ton was a speck of dust. Becomes very clear. Uh-oh.
Last year on mute.
You're still muted, Les.
But to me, that's that difference. It's progress, not perfection. The road gets more narrow. I mean, just because there can be a recognition.
Yes.
But it doesn't need to become, I don't ever want to believe that I'm omnipotent or perfect or any of that stuff. So even though that speck weighs a ton, I don't want it to feel like a ton.
Well, of course, you don't want it to be anything that it is. To make believe.
We've already gone back to the beginning.
Exactly. But you're at least catching that in the words you use and seeing that. So what would be perfect, though, Les, is something that has no comparative value. What's imperfect is when we look at things other than they are. Why? Because we see them as either less or more than they are. Because if we were seeing them as we are, we wouldn't be thinking about them. We'd just be witnessing them. We'd be letting them be. Another song that John Lennon wrote. Listen to his Imagine, the song Imagine. He's just talking about imagining, like actually utilizing thought for what its purpose is, which is imagination. And we turn it into thinking it's the creator of reality and truth rather than just a place to consider things. So that perfection, if there's an absolute state that doesn't change, that's the perfection that's the basis of our existence. It doesn't mean our thinking and bodies are going to act that way, but they're perfectly capable because right now they are absolutely that thing. They can't be any less than something infinite. They're just forms in the midst of something that's a conscious seeming existence, but maybe nothing more than something in thought. You remember that part of the big book where Bill wrote, having been granted a perfect release from alcohol, why shouldn't we, by the same means, achieve a perfect release from all of our problems and difficulties? Or defects and difficulties, I think he says. Interesting question, right? And then he goes on to say, perhaps this is the riddle of the universe, meaning that brains can't figure it out, because who are riddles for but brains, not the universe? And he continues by saying, perhaps the answer is only in the mind of God. He's giving us the answer to the riddle. That whatever that supreme source is the answer. And we know that answer because it wouldn't be supreme if we didn't. We would be exceptions to it and exclusive to it, and we would have to be bigger than it. And you can't be bigger than infinity. There's no such thing because there's nothing spatial in it. There's no size to it. It's something that's a realm outside of space and time and dimensional qualities and this or that. So if you compare something that's absolute to if you compare anything to itself, it's perfect, first of all. But if you consider the opposite of something that's absolute and infinite, guess what? It happens to be absolute and infinite. So the opposite of something that's infinite is the same. It doesn't have an opposite. So it can't be divided because it's not in that realm of relative thinking. And people might say, well, why do you have any assurance that there's anything infinite? And I would ask, why do we presume that the finite is finite when obviously what would be beyond the finite to make it finite? What would limit a limit but something greater than the limit. How is it that the universe is expanding into greater space if there isn't something to expand into? That something must be there now, regardless of the expansion of the universe. So that would at least speak in some terms that might be palatable and digestible to the concept that why would we presume everything is finite without recognizing that finite and infinite would be the same? And one would include the other, or both would include the other simultaneously. When we're looking at everything in total, the absolute nature of things becomes clear, just like with change being change. If everything's always changing, the one thing that isn't changing is that everything's changing. But you have to think of everything before that can happen. And what is that? Unifying. It's not separating and dividing and fighting and contrasting and conflicting. All of those are just positions we take. And if we can take them, when we think we can't do anything else, we think we've been taken by them. And that's addiction. We think thoughts are happening to us. We think ego is attacking us. We think our brain is attacking us. It's impossible. Our brain has no volition on its own. We ask it to do what it does. And in those things, interestingly, in that point, in those things that it does to manage the issues in our body that we don't think about, there is no argument or conflict in us about that at all. Nothing. Doesn't even rise to the occasion of thought, which suggests that there is a knowing nature even within our body to be doing what it's doing, sensing what it's sensing, aware of what it's aware of. And it's what we think about those things that causes our conflict. It's the diminishment of our capacity, like diminished capacity even in the law, reduces the potential liability or responsibility. In life, it doesn't. All it reduces is our awareness of the fullness of life by making believe that somehow we're diminished. It's just an experience we create. It doesn't diminish anything, just our experience. And even that isn't diminished except to the thinking we do about the experience we think we're having. Silence is that knowing power.
Or it's just Anthony not here.
What's that?
I said, or it's just Anthony not here. I was like, what's so different? I'm like,
Well, MK, you broke in on his behalf, so thank you.
in his honor.
Think about those. Now that we're at that point of looking at those things, and my sense is as the conversation goes from thinking about the self-centered stories we tell and all the conflicts, as it starts to expand in the direction of beginning to consider this, the real exploration is starting to think, what would be possible that I haven't thought was possible in my own experience if I started recognizing that the nature of my existence is in fact fully intact, perfectly intact, the nature of my existence, not that what I do with it is perfect, because that would mean that I'm letting everything I'm doing be what it is as I do it. And I haven't developed that skill yet, because a lot of what I do, I don't think I should be doing, just like you talked about, Les. I don't think I should be doing, I think I should be doing something else. All that kind of conflict still goes on. I know what it is now. That's the only difference. I just say, oh, I'm up to something. There's something going, there's something brewing that I'm not paying any attention to. But if I pay that attention to it, it begins to dispel the rumor that it's all that's happening. And I begin to actually have some inner perspective and understanding of what's happening, because it is never a secret except to the idea that I think I can keep it a secret, which is another form of denial, defiance, defense, and all those sorts of proactive activities that go into pretending what's happening isn't happening or shouldn't be happening, or what's supposed to be happening isn't happening, so it should be something else, and I should be somewhere else with something else or someone else. And when I finally get there, I'll have what I ultimately want, and wonder when I do why I don't. It's like, because all my practice is it. If my whole life has been practicing not thinking I'm where I belong, when I finally get to where I am, what am I going to think? I don't belong here. I've developed the skill so well, I think that's my mastery. So the bigger question is, what would happen if we were waking up in the morning and beginning to consider that all possibility is possible, which even considers all of the dereliction of thought that we're having that gives us the horror stories and ideas about, oh, it's another day and what's going to go wrong and what's going to suck about this and all that. But what is the actual possibility in that thinking of things that would be possible that we don't think are possible at all? What are those possibilities? That's the exploration. That's the discussion, because now it's simply consideration. And if we can consider things accurately to put to rest things that are inaccurate, then considering things accurately on the grandest scale would start to give us a context for starting to see how small the thing we've been doing is in terms of thinking, and start to recognize that low self-esteem and low self-worth and feeling disconnected and apart from is simply a natural consequence of thinking thoughts that are so small that the reflection that we have had and all those things we think we need to fix and get over and change and make better are actually accurate reflections of exactly what we've been doing. And that is a sign of high intelligence, to be able to create an absolute mirror of what's going on accurately, without any thought, and then simply recognize it's only what I think about it that's given me the impression it isn't what should be happening and put me at odds with the consequence, rather than start to notice, no, this consequence is perfectly designed for me to see clearly. I'm just reading it wrong. I'm literally thinking it's in French and I don't know how to read French, so I say it's a language I don't understand. And what do? All I think about in my head is in English. I don't think about things as sentient awarenesses. Typically, I think of them in the language of my choice. Those body signals are a different language, but they're perfectly clear. And we know that they're clear, and we dismiss them because they don't add up to the chalkboard mentality we have about what language means. So in considering that stuff, it's pretty profound. Because if nature is nature and this is our nature, it would not take, every paradigm shift in human history has just happened. Nobody planned for it. There weren't a lot of billboards up about it. There wasn't a lot of indoctrination that had to be insisted on people. It just changed. People just changed the way they thought. They just changed the idea that the horizon was the end of the beginning of doom and the end of anything. That just stopped. Or that we were in the middle of the universe. Oh, we're not. Until Stephen Hawking said everything in an infinite universe is at the center, because there are no edges. Interesting concept. What's the difference? One is divisive, one is separate, one is alone. The other one is united, complete, whole. If everybody's at the center, then we can all be self-centered and be the best we can be for each other, because we see it as the best we can do as a result of what we have. We can think of ourselves in any way we want. Why do we think about it in ways that are so inestimable and need to build esteem and build confidence and build ambition and fight for all those things, rather than say, how much greater could what I have be than everything? And any lack in my expression of that would certainly create an impression that something's missing, something's depreciated, something's not happening that could be happening. And yet what's happening is happening. If I can start where I am, since it's where I've always started, it makes a big difference than to start where I think I need to be, should have been, would have been, could have been, if it hadn't been for this, that, or them, which are no longer happening. And still everything that happened is the sum total of everything that I'm witnessing right now. All of us. The present moment is the sum total of everything that's ever happened, and standing in the face of everything that can possibly happen. All of it right now, simultaneously, without division, without imperfection, without lack, without more or less. But in this conversation, we're going to include less. More becomes less. It doesn't become a fight. It's just a viewpoint. It's just a position taken. That's all. And if a position can be taken, it can be given up as quickly as it can be taken. If we think we can only take the positions that lock us into the forced march of continually thinking about them, it's just untrue. It's just not true. And what isn't true is false, by the way. And to think it's true is how a lie is made up. To take what's false and think it's true, and to take what's true and think it's false are how lies are made up. And nothing is hidden. We are affected by it all the time. We are aware of it all the time. We can pretend we're going numb to justify the denial, but denial is an attempt at numbness. And numbness is actually evidence of pain, not the absence of pain. So what could we do? Anything, everything. Starts to diminish the size of the little problems we thought were everything to begin to consider everything in real terms rather than everything only being what we struggle with, our problems. Want to call it a day, since it's a day?
No, there's got to be more.
Everybody's gotten really good at muting.
Too good. Why don't you ask us a question?
Jackie,
I just did.
I have a question, Jackie.
Yeah.
How did that event work out for you?
Oh, the gay event? It didn't work out good. I didn't bring Matt. I didn't bring him. And he was very hurt.
Well, but it worked out.
But it did.
I was gonna say we kind of worked that out. It worked out then.
It did work out. Matt and I, we've healed from it. But it was really good that I didn't bring him because I got to talk to the producer and I learned some things that I wouldn't have learned if he had gone. Or, maybe I just, who knows, maybe she would have been fine with it, but, and there was a huge performance thing of the show that I wasn't invited to because I'm bi. So it would have been even worse if I brought that.
So it's just a new form of discrimination.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. But I also get where they're coming from. They want to support lesbians.
Yeah. So in the range of possibilities, my question was, if we're considering all things are possible, what is possible? What do we talk about that seems limitless? Look at the attachment we have to the limitations we face rather than the possibilities of acting in ways, thinking in ways. By the way, thinking is a primary action leading to all voluntary outward actions. So what would that thinking be if we were considering possibility being possible all the time?
That it could change any minute. And that's what they say in, because I want to be my authentic self. Also in the Wizard of Oz, not Wizard of Oz, sorry, Alice in Wonderland, they say to think 8 possible things before breakfast. And
Impossible?
I always loved that.
But think of that. If they're impossible, they're not possible. But if they're thought to be impossible because they haven't happened, they're still possible.
Right.
So they're thinking possibilities.
Exactly. Yeah. Right.
So
maybe my bisexuality will be embraced in a huge way.
Well, when you talk about only wanting to be your authentic self, you are your authentic self.
Yeah. I'm Jackie.
That self is probably not defined by what you think it is.
Right.
But there's an essence that maybe the self is what we all share, not one that's divided or independent or individual or any of that. That essence is what we all know. And if we were to talk in those terms, we would see a communal effort develop naturally as to how to solve the issues that we consistently, persistently recreate. And I would suggest we're trying to get our attention to say, this isn't working. And what's working about it is destructive and harmful and negative. We're trying to negate what we're doing and minimize it by making it look better than it is, by saying we're not hurting people, and people who are hurting that if I'm not looking at them, it's not happening because I've got my own little world carved out and think that my insulation makes it better. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
So that unifying difference is major.
Right.
And it exists right now, no matter what we think. And it's only thinking that stampedes its way in the impression that maintaining it is somehow going to make it better one day. When all we're doing is getting better at reinforcing what's wrong.
Yeah.
So better isn't always better when what's getting better is what's wrong. We're actually getting better at making things worse. And I would say that's what we're seeing on our streets very clearly in the way that we're approaching the problem.
Right.
Goethe, another one of his quotes I read earlier was, self-esteem is the reputation we acquire with ourself.
Reputation. Say it again.
Self-esteem is the reputation we acquire with ourselves. And if we think about if who we think we are is something we need to be better than, then we don't think very well of ourselves. And it's probably an accurate assessment of the self that's not thinking well, because the self born in thought is only based on what we think. It has no existence beyond thought, just like lies have no existence beyond thought. So that's ego, good. In terms of a thing, is just a name for what we think of ourselves. And if all we think we are is what we think, why wouldn't we think things that aren't esteemable?
Right. Ooh la 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 la. So good.
So it's that concession is the simple admission, acceptance of what's happening is what's happening. And it isn't because I do that what's happening begins to happen, because what's happening is happening regardless of whether I do that. And there's the freedom, is starting to realize, oh, it's happening despite what I'm thinking. It's not happening to spite what I'm thinking. It's not a contest against what I'm thinking. Right. I'm setting the whole thing up to have it look like it's a fight worth fighting, when I'm actually the creator of the fight and I'm the enemy in the fight. And I'm actually fighting with myself and thinking the world has constantly got to be at conflict to warrant something bigger than me is happening in some way greater than what I'm doing, to simply deny and admit and avoid conceding what I'm actually creating. In my own experience, it's crazy.
You say a lot of things that I appreciate, Jack, and that was definitely one of them. You framed that very well.
My sense is we know these things and we're heartbroken over witnessing the results of the thinking we do that isn't aligned with those things. Literally heartbroken, that we're sad and depressed for good reason. At least reason has the good sense enough to actually impose on us consequences that are accurate, regardless of what we think about them. And to think what's accurate about what's happening shouldn't be happening is inaccurate, because what is happening is in fact happening, regardless of what we think. And mental health is not helped by making believe that what we need to do is change what we're doing on the surface to feel better about it, when we're not actually getting to the core of the issue and what we're thinking about it that's causing it. And I'm not condemning anybody by saying that, but I would say if things are getting worse in terms of mental health, which I would say suicide is at an all-time high, addiction's at an all-time high, it's a critical problem around the world. There's some indication there that maybe it hasn't been addressed properly. Maybe. I don't want to say it isn't. Who knows? In total, I think it's a good supposition, if I'm to suppose something, that maybe there's some lack in what's being done, some lack in the awareness, some lack in the conversation. Maybe. My experience is that things that are misdiagnosed get worse. If a problem isn't understood, it gets worse. The solution to a problem is always in the understanding of the problem. Always. As soon as you understand the problem, the solution's obvious. The only complications are caused by thinking the problem isn't the problem. And when you think the problem isn't the problem and you're trying to solve the problem, that's a problem. The problem is never the problem until we see our own involvement in the problem and our own creation of the problem. And without that, we're hopeless. And I would say it's a pretty good experience that people are experiencing right now. Apathy is not a function of not caring. It's a function of not knowing what to do and to not wanting to repeat what's been done because of an awareness that it isn't working. It's a standing on the sideline saying, I'm not going to participate in this game because it's just a bloodbath for no good purpose. It's an actual indication of concern and regard to be able to step out and say, I'm going to take a neutral position rather than one that engages one side or the other, because if I engage one side, I am engaging the other. And neutrality ultimately is that center point on the teeter-totter that doesn't go up and down. It moves very slightly back and forth, like a gentle rocking, compared to the extreme movement of both sides, the extreme positions we can take. The center point is almost still. Seeing both sides as the same puts us in that center point rather than to one edge or the other, rather than out of balance in some way.
There's a movie on Apple. Again, they're just making things that I appreciate lately. It's called Luck. And it's an animation, it's fun. It's about a little girl and a cat, really. And all they're talking about is how unlucky she is. She's just got terrible luck. And by the end of the movie, clearly they're just like, bad luck is a myth. It's just it's just a myth. It's just things that happen.
It's an
the
excuse.
Whole movie was just talking about it's things that happen. This happens, this happens. You can't have one without the other. And they balanced it in this very interesting way. And it's very juvenile in its approach, but it was very in-depth and accurate in its story. Because it was, of course, they wanted everything to be happy, so they turned this into all happiness, and then clearly it blew up. It didn't work.
No, it never does.
They needed to come back to that balanced space. And I remember the one point, they're like, I don't want to go to the bad luck place. And he's like, it's just a myth. And then the story shifted. And I'm like, I see where they're going with this.
So you see that this conversation is not obviously limited to what we're talking about.
The part that I thought was funny is in the bad luck world, they all hung out at bars.
Yeah.
I picked that up. I don't think anybody else picked that up. But I was like, wait, they're at a bar. I was like, why is that the spot? But
partying is at an all-time high. I mean, it's the sensational aspect of partying and glorifying this constant celebration is very interesting at a time when humanity is suffering as much as they've ever suffered. And it may be that many, many people are better off today, but many, many people are also not better off today. Many, many people. So it's interesting that we would commit ourselves to so heartily. But, it's the same kind of denial we try to use in our own lives when we try to feel better about things that are worse. Buy the new car, get the new stuff. It's not to suggest that shouldn't be done. I'm not taking opinion on that.
I just bought a new car.
I'm just congratulations. I'm just suggesting that a lot of that is done to give some relief to the problem that isn't being relieved. And it just adds another layer of responsibility. It's like cars are always great in the first 6 months, but then you realize you got about 65 payments left.
Yeah.
And when it's still running, your last payment is the same as the first. It's really easy when you got the first payment, but it's a little more difficult 6 years down the road. But
agreed.
Anyway, I think the conversation, my experience is even within the thinking I do, my experience is that the conversation is revelatory and redemptive because it allows for the focus to be shifted away from the stories and the pettiness and all the things we do that are self-pitying to warrant the constant talk about the problem rather than begin to say, oh, they're just things I'm doing that, obviously aren't right. And obviously I'm doing it. That's it. right, wrong, should be, shouldn't be, whatever all those things are is irrelevant to the fact that it's happening. Then at least then I've let things be as they are enough to begin to notice them and live with them and consider them for what they are rather than what I think they should be or could have been or might be or will be, and just simply live with that. And the accuracy of that is incredibly revealing because there's nothing hidden except for our preoccupation of distracting ourselves from what's happening. And even then, it's not hidden. All we're doing is engulfing ourselves in opinions and ideas that give us the impression it's not happening. And those impressions get depressing over time. They lead to depression because they create stress. They create anxiety for good reason, beautiful reason, perfect reason, actually. Common sense is actually common, but we mistake it and misplace it by making believe the common sense is the insanity we're doing by perpetuating the ideas that we're not doing what we're doing, rather than looking at the fact that we know clearly we're doing what we're doing because we're feeling all the things we're feeling that reflect the doing of the doing. And it's just a breath. It's kind of like, wow, if I'm doing that, I'm going a long distance to try to pretend I'm not. That is a lot of effort. That's a lot of no wonder I'm tired. So I love you guys. I appreciate this.
Same.
After our Sunday off,
Agreed.
Jackie, it's good to see you in person.
Great. Yeah, it was great, right?
Yeah.
I love hearing you guys' voices. I'm here. I'm just one-handed.
No, I was gonna say, do we have an addition?
Oh yeah.
We do. Oh yeah.
we have a
We're
special
about a little over
guest.
6 weeks in. A little over 6 weeks.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
I'd show you guys, but it's literally I'm on my phone, and it would be a balancing act. We don't want to try.
What? How's wifey?
Good. Everything is moving and growing and doing exactly what it's supposed to do. You know,
Do we have a
challenging
name for
things
this
as
special
well.
person yet?
Yes. Her name is Lady.
Lady?
Mm-hmm.
I
Lady
love
Francis.
that.
Mhm.
Lady
Yeah, it's cute.
Francis?
That's her middle name. Francis is
I
her middle name.
love that. So
Adorable.
Cute, right?
pretty.
It's cute, right?
Yeah,
That is very
Lady
cute.
Francis.
He didn't even have to be sanctioned by the Queen.
Right.
That's right. That was our thinking.
I love that.
I was all torn up around the idea that maybe it was going to, confuse her when she finally was made a lady, but I think I might have been a little ahead of myself.
Well, maybe by then she'll be Grande Dame.
That's right. We figured we're going to skip right over that part.
Well, congrats. I'm glad that's everything's going
Thanks so
well.
much, guys. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Congratulations. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.
Love
See
you
ya.
guys.
Bye.